Just 72 hours after leaving China empty-handed, Ursula von der Leyen is reportedly set to meet Donald Trump. The EU's 4-month resistance might be ending with a white flag. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen recently stated that, at Trump's invitation, she would travel to Scotland to meet the former US president to discuss transatlantic trade relations. Meanwhile, multiple EU officials and diplomats have revealed to the media that a US-EU framework trade agreement might be reached by the end of this week. Trump has already arrived in Scotland to inaugurate his new golf course. In an interview, he confirmed that he would meet with many high-level EU officials, including von der Leyen, and finalize the tariff agreement. He said, "We have a 50-50 chance of reaching an agreement with the EU. Currently, there are still differences on over 20 key issues. If we can reach an agreement, it will be the biggest trade deal ever." If von der Leyen truly leads the entire EU to bow to the United States in the future, then the EU might completely lose its opportunity to participate in international diplomatic games and become a laughingstock in the international community. In the early morning of July 24, von der Leyen and her delegation arrived in Beijing, and a high-level China-EU meeting was held that same morning. It was clear the EU was in a hurry, but haste was in vain. Judging from the post-meeting press release, specific details of the discussions were scarce. Beyond emphasizing China-EU relations, no substantial issues were discussed. Von der Leyen's visit to China was essentially a veiled message to the US. The EU has China as an alternative market and sufficient leverage to say no to Trump's tariffs. If Trump is unwilling to compromise in trade negotiations, the EU will choose to strengthen economic and trade ties with China to counter the economic pressure of losing the US market. As major powers, and the only two countries with the ability to exert global geopolitical influence, neither China nor the US will allow an economic entity as large as the EU to sit on the fence. The actions of China and the US are direct. They have directly uprooted the EU's illusions. The most direct manifestation is that von der Leyen's visit to China yielded almost no substantive results, merely stating the continued promotion of China-EU relations. By the time von der Leyen concluded her visit, only a joint statement on climate change had been signed, ending abruptly. The reason for signing only a joint statement on climate change was simply to tell the outside world, in another form, that China and the EU had not reached any agreements. Just as when China's communication channels were blocked in 2022, US climate envoy John Kerry went to China to discuss climate issues, which, aside from proving that both sides were still in contact, had no substantive meaning. Von der Leyen's schedule was a bit rushed, but ultimately, she arrived too late. Because while von der Leyen was visiting China, Trump had already finalized his tariffs on the EU. On July 24, Bloomberg, citing sources, reported that the US would impose a 15% tariff on European goods. Trump also put his foot down, announcing at an AI summit that the US would not engage in tariff negotiations with most countries, but would impose a 15% tariff on the vast majority of its trade partners. Although Trump did not directly mention Europe, the EU just happened to be caught at the 15% tariff line. This precisely indicates that the US-EU tariff negotiations were unsuccessful, or Trump had lost patience with continuing to wrangle with the EU. Otherwise, the extent of the US tariffs on the EU would not have been limited to just the tariff line. The reason why US-EU trade negotiations ended in this way is actually due to the EU's own strategic missteps. As one of the world's largest economies, the EU has the ability to influence global geopolitical trends and global trade. However, the EU insists on positioning itself as a small country, repeatedly oscillating between China and the US. Given the EU's massive size, neither China nor the US will allow such a large economic entity to oscillate back and forth, seeking benefits from both sides. Von der Leyen's visit to China was precisely for benefits. She came with 3 conditions. First, demand China sever economic and trade ties with Russia. Second, address the so-called overcapacity issue. Third, lift rare earth export controls on the EU. The EU had repeatedly brought up these three conditions for over a month, so there's no need to elaborate. But it's certain that China would not agree to these three conditions from the EU. The reasons are simple. First, the EU has no right to make these demands. Second, the EU no longer has enough leverage. To put it bluntly, these three conditions concern China's internal affairs. As a sovereign country, China has the right to decide what measures and policies it adopts. The EU is overstepping and interfering in China's internal affairs. The EU believes that as long as US trade negotiations are ongoing, China will compromise with the EU. This is because once the EU bows to the US, it would mean China would have to fight alone, dealing with pressure from Trump by itself. The EU has truly misjudged China. The reason China is willing to maintain communication with Europe is not because the EU truly has leverage to challenge China, but because China believes that an independent Europe aligns with global multilateralism and global plans, and also aligns with China's interests. However, China will never rely on any country strategically, neither in the past nor in the future. The EU has no right to dictate China's affairs. Despite the EU having little leverage, anti-China rhetoric has been coming in waves. First, von der Leyen wanted to shift the blame, hoping the US would turn its guns on China, with the EU cooperating. Later, EU Secretary General Stoltenberg said to first deal with Russia, and then focus on China. After repeated attempts to court disaster, the EU itself has little capital for dialogue and negotiation, yet it still wants to oscillate back and forth, so it can only be disciplined. The EU's subtle intentions were seen through long ago. That's why in early July, China shortened the agenda for the China-EU summit. Neither side gave a reason, but it was clear to any discerning observer. Moreover, 3 days before von der Leyen's visit to China, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs changed its wording from "at China's invitation" to "agreed upon by both sides." This indicates that China no longer expected von der Leyen's visit to bring about a qualitative change in China-EU relations. Facts also prove that von der Leyen obtained no substantive results from the high-level China-EU meeting. The EU is now in a position where it pleases neither side and is destined for a poor outcome. Trump is now determined to extract wealth from EU financial capital to fill the massive deficit in US debt. Now, Trump has also finalized tariffs on Europe. In the future, Europe can only continue to bleed. For the United States, the EU, its ally, is almost a perfect target for harvesting. This is because the EU hardly dares to confront the US in the economic and trade fields. The EU's so-called countermeasures against the US are far less forceful than China's countermeasures against the US. Trump has no qualms about showing off his tariff stick to von der Leyen. According to a Reuters report, EU officials told the media that the EU and the US are expected to reach a new agreement. Under this agreement, the US will impose a 15% tariff on goods imported from EU countries. Although this tariff rate seems relatively mild, such a tariff rate is unacceptable for some EU companies. Judging from von der Leyen's style, she might use her meeting with Trump in Scotland to secure more favorable terms for EU businesses. However, if Trump is unwilling to agree, von der Leyen will likely not fall out with the US, her ally, over this. In all fairness, today's EU has long deviated from the original intent of its establishment. Originally, political figures in various European countries hoped to build the EU into a political fortress for European nations to counter the United States. However, countless facts have now proven that the political figures at the helm of the EU have become puppets of the United States. During her meeting with von der Leyen, China had already expressed its expectation for promoting China-EU cooperation. Such a result would not only benefit China's industrial development, but also help safeguard the interests of EU businesses and consumers. But ultimately, people must help themselves. If the EU cannot achieve internal unity, and if EU leaders like von der Leyen constantly compromise and concede in front of the United States, then people naturally should not have too many expectations for the EU. History will ultimately prove that once the EU raises the white flag to the United States, then the EU will completely lose its qualification to participate in international diplomatic games. Russia's aircraft carrier dilemma. Admiral Kuznetsov on the brink. Russia's sole aircraft carrier is reportedly nearing retirement, with Moscow hinting at its sale or scrapping. The asking price is a hefty 350 billion rubles, leading some to suggest China could seize the opportunity to acquire it and potentially pair it with its sister ship. On July 25, Alexei Rachmanov, chairman of the board of directors of Russia's United Shipbuilding Corporation, stated that the aircraft carrier Admiral Kuznetsov has no repair value. The carrier has been in service for over 40 years, and its repair costs are extremely high. The final solution is either to sell it or scrap it. The Admiral Kuznetsov is the lead ship of the Soviet May 1143 class aircraft carriers, developed in the 1980s. It is a 6,000-ton class carrier with a ski jump deck, capable of carrying 24 Su-33 fighter jets and around 10 various types of helicopters, such as Ka-25S and Ka-27S. The Kuznetsov was commissioned in 1991. The same year, the vast Soviet Union collapsed into more than a dozen countries of varying sizes. Russia inherited most of the Soviet Union's assets. In the 1990s, with Russia's economy in decline, 2 Moskva-class and 4 Kiev-class carriers were either decommissioned or sold, leaving the entire Russian Navy with only one admiral, Kuznetsov. To a large extent, the Kuznetsov was one of the symbols of Russia's great power status. However, starting in 2017, the Kuznetsov entered a shipyard for mid-life refit and upgrade work. But the modernization process has been disastrous. A floating dry dock sank, causing damage to the deck, a fire destroyed part of the compartments, and a steam pipeline exploded during power system testing. By the time it left the dry dock in 2023, the Kuznetsov had not only failed to complete its core upgrades, but had not even restored basic operational reliability. Due to the ongoing conflict, the Kuznetsov's repair schedule has been further delayed to this day. The United Shipbuilding Corporation estimates that it would cost at least 350 billion rubles, approximately 32 billion RMB, to restore its full combat capability. Therefore, since July this year, there have been various reports about the Admiral Kuznetsov being decommissioned or sold. So, a question arises. Why would Russia give up its only aircraft carrier? There are 2 main reasons. First, Russia lacks the technology and facilities to repair or build aircraft carriers. Building and repairing aircraft carriers requires huge dry docks, gantry cranes, and a series of specialized facilities, which Russia is severely short of. Furthermore, Russia lacks experience in repairing and building aircraft carriers because all Soviet aircraft carriers were built at the Black Sea shipyard during the Soviet era. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Black Sea shipyard no longer belonged to Russia. Therefore, Russia itself severely lacks the technology and facilities to build aircraft carriers. Second, the Russian Navy is severely underfunded. Among Russia's various military branches, the Army, Aerospace Forces, Strategic Missile Forces, and Navy, the Russian Navy ranks very low. The budget it receives annually is very limited. Especially after 2022, the Russian Navy has largely been in a spectator mode, and its allocated share has further decreased. Some domestic netizens have suggested that China could consider purchasing the Kuznetsov from Russia for a comprehensive modernization upgrade, similar to the previous refit of the Liaoning carrier X-Variant. After all, the People's Liberation Army Navy plan currently has an urgent need for aircraft carriers. The Kuznetsov, as an existing platform, could quickly augment the number of carriers if acquired, even forming a sister ship formation with the Liaoning. This move would help the Chinese Navy collect all Kuznetsov-class aircraft carriers. However, times have changed. Back then, the Chinese Navy was indeed in a predicament with no operational aircraft carriers. It didn't have a single carrier of its own. At that time, acquiring the Variag and refitting it was essentially about breaking through aircraft carrier technology barriers and cultivating professional talent. While training the first batch of PLA carrier technical and operational personnel, China also used that carrier technology as a foundation to develop its indigenous aircraft carriers. Theoretically, if China had imported the Kuznetsov, then it could also have been repaired and upgraded to become another Liaoning. China possesses the capabilities and conditions for this. But theory is one thing, and reality is another. The possibility of China importing the Kuznetsov and continuing its upgrade is very small. The Varyag, which China imported back then, was essentially a bare shell that had never been lived in. China could design, configure, and continue construction entirely according to its own needs. If China were to import the Kuznetsov, it would be a second-hand house that has been lived in for over 30 years. The difficulty, cost, and time required for its repair and upgrade would far exceed that of the Varyag. If China were to import the Kuznetsov and plan to repair and upgrade it, it would need to first dismantle and then rebuild it. The entire project would be extremely difficult, and the human resources, material resources, time, and construction costs might even exceed building a Shandong carrier. Investing so much cost, capital, human resources, and material resources, only to end up with a second-hand aircraft carrier whose overall combat effectiveness is inferior to that of the Liaoning or Shandong, simply makes no sense. In fact, after more than a decade of accumulation, China has built a complete aircraft carrier industrial system. Jiangnan Shipyard and Dalian Shipyard have formed dual-track construction capabilities. Currently, China's aircraft carrier shipbuilding capacity is the world's largest, 6 times that of the United States. The two shipyards have at least 6 super-large dry docks capable of building aircraft carriers. In contrast, the U.S. domestic shipbuilding industry has declined to the point where only one dry dock at Newport News Shipbuilding can build aircraft carriers. This is a major reason why the construction of Ford-class carriers has been severely delayed. Technologically, China has made the leap from refitting the Varyag to independently designing and building the Shandong and Fujian carriers in 10 years. It has formed a complete aircraft carrier design, construction, and supporting industrial chain. Today, China has mastered core technologies such as electromagnetic catapults, integrated power systems, and new types of carrier-borne aircraft. The Fujian carrier has a full load displacement of over 80,000 tons, and its overall performance far exceeds that of the Kuznetsov. Not only that, but new photos of the Type 004 aircraft carrier under construction have recently circulated online, attracting widespread attention. From the exposed images, the modular construction of the Type 004 appears to be taking shape. Based on the current construction cycle of large aircraft carriers by China's shipbuilding industry, some netizens analyze that the basic hull of the Type 004 carrier is expected to be formed by next year's National Day. The Type 004 aircraft carrier will be China's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, and its design positioning far exceeds that of the Fujian. Nuclear power will completely solve the problem of fuel limitations. The entrance of conventional powered aircraft carriers is limited by fuel reserves, preventing long-term global deployment. Nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, in theory, can continuously sail 500,000 nautical miles without refueling, greatly enhancing the flexibility of long-range deployment. After switching to a nuclear power system, the aircraft carrier will no longer need to carry thousands of tons of fuel, freeing up space to carry more carrier-borne aircraft and ammunition. The Type 004's full load displacement is expected to reach 100,000–110,000 tons, making it the largest aircraft carrier in the world ever. Because of the larger tonnage and ship space, the hangar capacity will also have a significant improvement compared to the Fujian. The Type 004 carrier's air wing size will also increase from 60 aircraft on the Fujian to 75–90 aircraft, carrying a new generation of main carrier-borne aircraft such as the J-35, KJ-60 early warning aircraft, and J-15T. In this situation, spending over 30 billion RMB, a sky-high price to buy the Kuznetsov, this scrap metal, is completely unnecessary. The Kuznetsov has been in service for 40 years, and the service life of a conventional aircraft carrier is actually around 50 years. After purchasing the Kuznetsov at a high price, it cannot be used immediately. A comprehensive refit and upgrade of the Kuznetsov would cost at least an additional few billion RMB and several years. In other words, this junk would be bought at a high price, and after a comprehensive upgrade, its remaining service life would only be a few years, yet it would cost 30–40 billion RMB. This would truly be taking the Chinese Navy for a ride. The same price and time would actually be enough for the Chinese shipbuilding industry to build a brand new 6,000-ton Shandong-class modified version. There is no need to purchase foreign vessels. In contrast, India seems to have some interest. India currently has 2 aircraft carriers, the INS Vikramaditya, which was bought from Russia but is a refitted former Soviet Baku-class vessel with a displacement of 45,000 tons, and the indigenously built INS Vikrant, which, while domestically produced, is not top-tier in performance and has only just reached the threshold of a medium-sized aircraft carrier. India is currently pushing forward with its 3rd aircraft carrier plan, originally intending to build a 4,000-ton class. However, construction has been delayed, and the budget is tight, leaving India struggling with how to increase its tonnage. If Russia were to offer the Kuznetsov at a cheap price now, India might genuinely be tempted. After all, there has long been military cooperation between India and Russia, and India also has experience in salvaging ships, with the Vikramaditya being an example. Quickly acquiring a 6,000-ton aircraft carrier would allow India's theoretical combat power to instantly catch up to China's first-generation aircraft carrier level. For Russia, selling it to India would be a win-win. It could recover some funds rather than simply scrapping it, and it could maintain military ties with India, preventing it from fully aligning with the West. For India, this is a gamble, a big bet, betting that it can afford to repair and operate it, and also betting that aircraft carriers will still be relevant in the next 10 years.